Princess Zala had traveled across the stars for this cultural exchange, which sounded prestigious but felt quite frankly like a test. She had sat through seminars on Earth's climate, languages, and customs, yet no lecture had prepared her for the meat market. Evan's shop, Grill and Thrill, was bustling with humans when she arrived, all bustling around the counters, shouting orders and waving tickets. She had been sent here to observe Earth's dietary customs. Something about the way humans processed their food was important to interspecies understanding. She wasn't exactly convinced, but she was here to learn, so she pressed on. Evan, the human assigned to guide her, was different from the instructors she'd met before. He wore an apron over a plaid shirt, had a grin that was a little too confident, and spoke with an easy charm. The butchery seemed second nature to him, his hands deftly handling each cut as if he'd done it 1,000 times, and his pride for his craft was evident, especially when he turned to her, holding a large slab of meat with a grin. "So, Princess, ever seen sausage making?" he asked, with a playful twinkle in his eye. Zala felt a spark of curiosity. "I haven't. We prepare food quite differently on my world." "Well," he chuckled, "I think you're in for a surprise. Sausage making is a bit of an art around here." He led her to the back of the shop, away from the crowd, and started his demonstration. First, he showed her the spices, carefully measured and mixed, fragrant with earthly aromas that Zala found both curious and unexpectedly appealing. Next, he pulled out the casing, which looked like an oddly shaped tube. Zala tilted her head, intrigued and slightly puzzled. "And what exactly is the casing?" "Oh, this," he said, with a sheepish grin. It's from the animal. Just like the meat, basically. It holds everything together. Keeps all that flavor sealed up tight." Zala gave a thoughtful nod. "Interesting. So, humans really use every part of the animal?" "Pretty much," he replied. "Nothing goes to waste." She was impressed, though she couldn't help a teasing glance. "You Earthlings do have a habit of improvising with what you're given." Evan laughed, clearly catching the subtext in her tone. "I suppose we do," he replied, with a mock bow. "It's one of our many charms." As they continued, he began mixing the spices into the meat, his hands working the mixture with precision. Zala watched, fascinated by his movements, the strength in his hands, the ease with which he handled everything. His passion for this craft was evident, and she couldn't deny her admiration, not just for his skill but for the man himself. "So, what made you want to learn all this?" she asked. Genuinely curious, Evan shrugged, still focused on his task. "Family business. My granddad started this shop, and I just picked it up. Always liked working with my hands. And people around here know they can count on us for quality. Feels good, you know?" She nodded, smiling. "We have traditions like that on my world. Skills passed down, the old ways. It's honorable." He looked up at her, surprised by the warmth in her voice, and their eyes met for a moment, a connection sparking between them. Zala felt her pulse quicken and looked away, trying to shake off the feeling. But when he spoke again, his tone was softer. "You're different from what I imagined," he said, almost to himself. Her brow arched. "What did you imagine?" He shrugged, that grin back on his face. "Oh, you know, all regal, maybe a little stiff. Not someone who'd be interested in sausage." Zala couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and warm. "Well, consider me curious." The double meaning lingered between them, but before she could say anything else, he picked up the casing and began filling it, explaining each step in detail. "The key," he said, "is packing it just right. Not too tight, not too loose. You want it to be full and firm without bursting." Zala tried to focus on his words, but the intensity in his voice, the precision in his hands, the way he looked at her with that knowing grin, it was all making her feel unexpectedly flustered. She hadn't felt like this in a long time, drawn in by a human, no less. He handed her a pair of gloves. "Want to give it a shot?" She hesitated, then slipped them on, determined to meet his challenge. She mimicked his movements, feeling the casing fill under her hands, the mixture packing in steadily. She glanced up, catching his gaze as he watched her with a faint smile. "Not bad, Princess," he murmured. "You've got a natural touch." She smiled, feeling a warm thrill at his praise. "Maybe I'm just well suited to earthly customs." Their hands brushed as he guided her through the final twist of the sausage, and the small, innocent touch seemed to spark something between them, lingering in the air around them. She looked at him, heart pounding, the closeness between them suddenly all too real. The spell broke when the timer dinged, signaling that the sausages were ready. He quickly took them out and, with a proud grin, offered her one of the finished links. "Here's the moment of truth," he said, watching her intently. "Go on, give it a taste." Zala took the sausage, still warm, and brought it to her lips. Taking a small, tentative bite, the flavors burst across her tongue, smoky and spicy, a perfect harmony of textures and tastes she hadn't expected. She looked at him, eyes wide with genuine surprise. It's actually delicious," he laughed, looking as pleased as if he'd just won a prize. "Told you so." A little earthly flavor never hurt anyone. As she took another bite, savoring the taste, she realized that there was more to this world and to him than she had ever imagined. And as they stood there, sharing the quiet moment, she knew that her mission had taken on a whole new meaning, because while the flavors of Earth were intriguing, it was the human behind them that had truly captured her interest. It was late evening when Evan closed up shop, and the streets outside had grown quiet, save for the occasional hum of passing vehicles. Zala had insisted on learning everything there was to know about earthly flavors, so he invited her to stay a little longer, offering to cook her a true Earth dinner. She agreed without hesitation, her curiosity about human life now stretching far beyond his butcher shop. Evan led her to the back of the shop, where he had a small kitchen set up for demonstrations. He quickly busied himself at the stove, and as he started to prepare the meal, he glanced at her, catching her watching him with a faint smile. The air between them was charged, filled with something unspoken. "So, what are you making now?" she asked, leaning against the counter, arms crossed as she watched him work. "Just a simple steak," he said, flashing her a grin. "Seasoned with a little salt, pepper, and a few spices. Nothing too fancy, but I'd say it's one of the best things we've got here on Earth." She arched a brow, intrigued. "You humans and your love for animal meat. It's unusual, but fascinating," he chuckled. "Guess we're pretty passionate about our food. And besides," he paused, glancing at her, "it's not just about taste. It's about sharing an experience, something to enjoy together." As the steak sizzled on the pan, the rich aroma filled the kitchen, and Zala's expression softened, her usual poise slipping just a bit. She seemed almost enchanted by the smell, the sound, the warm atmosphere between them. For a moment, he felt a surge of confidence, the thrill of something unexpected blossoming between them. "So," he said, flipping the steak, "you must have customs like this on your planet. Sharing food, spending time together?" She nodded, her gaze drifting to the sizzling pan. "Yes, but not like this. Our rituals are often formal, arranged. Very little is spontaneous. We're taught that emotions must be controlled, tempered." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the light from the stove. "But here, everything feels so different, alive, passionate." The way she said it made his heart beat a little faster. He was just about to respond when a loud bang erupted from the alley behind the shop, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Evan's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the back door to see what was going on. When they reached the door, they peered out, spotting two figures cloaked in shadow rummaging through his storage crates. Evan cursed under his breath. These were supplies he couldn't afford to lose, and he wasn't about to let some alley raiders ruin his night. "Stay here," he said, but Zala gripped his arm, her eyes sharp and determined. "Absolutely not. You forget I am trained in combat. I may be an observer here, but I am hardly defenseless." He smirked, both impressed and slightly skeptical. "All right, Princess, let's see what you've got." They crept out together, moving through the shadows until they were close enough to the intruders. Evan lunged forward, his hand gripping one of the men's shoulders as he spun him around. Zala moved with him, and in a fluid, almost graceful motion, she extended her arm, knocking the second intruder off balance with surprising force. The man struggled to his feet, his eyes wide as he took in her otherworldly appearance, the soft lavender glow in her skin, revealing her alien heritage. What the hell are you?" he stammered, stumbling backward. Zala's expression was calm, almost amused. "You don't need to know," she replied. Her voice low and steady, she took a step forward, and the men bolted, disappearing down the alley without a second glance. As they left, Zala brushed her hands off, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. "That wasn't difficult. I expected earthly combat to be more challenging." Evan laughed, shaking his head. "Remind me not to mess with you." That was kind of incredible. They stood there for a moment, the adrenaline of the encounter slowly fading, replaced by the quiet thrill of the shared experience. She looked up at him, her gaze lingering, her eyes reflecting something deeper, something neither of them could quite name. Back in the kitchen, they found the steak was just finished, slightly charred at the edges but still tempting. They sat down to eat, the quiet of the shop settling around them as they shared their makeshift meal. The taste was rich, smoky, the meat tender and flavorful. Zala savored each bite, her eyes closing briefly as she let the flavor wash over her. "It's amazing," she admitted, her voice soft. "Nothing on my world could compare to this." Evan watched her, a warmth filling his chest, glad to hear it. They sat in comfortable silence, the electricity between them growing with each moment. At one point, she reached for the salt, and their hands brushed, a small, innocent touch that sent a thrill through both of them. She looked up, her cheeks tinged with that familiar lavender glow. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "for showing me this in your world, your life. It's more than I expected." He leaned closer, his gaze locked on hers, his heart pounding. "Maybe there's more I can show you, if you're willing to stay a little longer." She held his gaze, her eyes reflecting the same desire, the same unspoken connection. "I think," she whispered, her voice laced with quiet resolve. "I'd like that." Their faces were close, the tension thick between them, but neither moved, letting the moment stretch, a promise hanging in the air. They didn't need words to know that this was only the beginning, a connection that transcended stars, customs, and worlds. As weeks passed, Zala's stay on Earth grew longer than either of them had planned. Each day brought a new discovery, a new taste, a new experience, and new memories she and Evan created together. What began as her duty had become something entirely different, a connection she felt in every fiber of her being. Yet, in the back of her mind, Zala knew she'd have to make a decision. Her time here was not meant to be permanent. She'd completed her research and gathered enough information to fulfill her duty to her people. But she couldn't ignore what had grown between her and Evan, a bond that made her heart race and her pulse quicken, and a feeling of belonging that felt both thrilling and terrifying. One quiet evening, after the last customer had left and the shop was locked up for the night, Evan invited her to the rooftop of the building. The night sky stretched out above them, stars glistening like jewels in the dark expanse. For a moment, Zala felt a pang of longing as she looked up, the distance between her world and his feeling both small and impossibly vast. "So," he said, leaning on the railing next to her, "you ever think about going back?" She looked at him, startled by the question. His gaze was steady, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding, as if he already knew the answer but needed to hear it from her. "I do," she replied softly, her voice barely audible over the gentle rustling of the wind. "But it's complicated." Evan gave a small nod, his fingers brushing hers as he leaned closer. "Yeah, I get that. You've got a life there, responsibilities, people who depend on you." She nodded, feeling the weight of her duty pressing down on her. But when she looked at him, all that weight seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that made her feel like she could be herself. No expectations, no formalities, just Zala, with him. "But I've also found something here," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "something I didn't expect. With you, everything feels real." They stood in silence for a moment, the words between them hanging heavy in the air. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the tension between his desire for her to stay and his respect for the life she had beyond this place. He finally spoke, his voice low. Zala, if you had to choose between going back and staying here, what would you do? The question hit her harder than she expected, the reality of her decision pressing in on her. But as she looked at him, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights below, she knew her answer. I would stay, she said, her voice strong and certain. If I had the choice, and I would stay here. With you! His eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerability in him, a glimpse of his own hopes and fears. He reached out, taking her hand in his, and their fingers intertwined, a silent promise between them. Then stay, he whispered, his voice filled with both hope and a quiet plea. I know it's a lot to ask, but I want you here, in my life. Zala's heart pounded, and without another word, she stepped closer. Their faces inches apart, she could feel the warmth of his breath, the softness of his touch, and in that moment, she knew she didn't need to say anything more. They leaned into each other, their lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle, yet filled with all the unspoken emotions they had both kept hidden. It was a kiss that bridged two worlds, a promise that transcended the stars. She felt his arms around her, grounding her, and she realized that this connection, this feeling was worth everything. As they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, a soft smile playing on her lips. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet joy. Not anymore. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's embrace, the world around them fading away as they held on to each other. And in that moment, Zala knew she had found her place, not in the duties of her homeland, not in the stars she once longed to explore, but here, with him. And as the night stretched on, they sat together under the vast expanse of the universe, dreaming of a future they would build, one shared meal and stolen moment at a time. Months had passed since Zala made her decision to stay, and each day had become a blend of the ordinary and extraordinary, a life she'd never imagined but now couldn't imagine leaving. Evan's butcher shop had transformed into a place that felt uniquely theirs. Zala, once an alien princess bound by duty, had taken on a role in the shop. Her presence had become a source of fascination for the community, the mysterious assistant with the accent and the knowing smile. But only Evan knew the depth of her story, the journey that had brought her here and the choice she'd made to stay. Their bond had only grown deeper, marked by laughter, shared meals, and moments of quiet understanding. And while Zala's people had reached out, concerned by her silence, she had sent back her decision, firm and resolute. She'd found her purpose, not in the duties she was born to fulfill, but in the life she had chosen, on her own terms. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood together on the rooftop, the first stars glimmering in the sky above. She leaned into Evan's arms, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of twilight. Ever miss it? He asked softly. Glancing at the stars, she looked up, a gentle smile on her face. Sometimes, but I don't regret my choice. I've found something here I never knew I needed. He squeezed her hand, a warmth spreading through him. Well, just so you know, I'm glad you picked Earth. She chuckled, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. So am I. As they stood together under the stars, Zala knew that her journey was only beginning. The universe was vast, filled with mysteries and worlds unknown. But for now, her world was here, in the life they had built, in the love they shared, a love that transcended planets, customs, and duty. And as the first lights of evening glowed across the sky, she felt a peace she had never known, grounded in the place she now called home.